This section will introduce you to the concepts used to bridge that gap seen between the practice and execution of sports psychology concepts. And all of this information is intended to maximize your understanding of sports psychology in order for you to be better able to assist students, athletes, and exercisers, regardless of the setting, or even if it's an individual or group-based practice. If you've not read the companion text, Foundations of Exercise and Sports Psychology, we really recommend that you complete the reading first. There's an online study guide included with the purchase of your textbook, and we encourage you to tap into that as a resource as well. And this will also make sure that you get more value out of this course. Since there is a lot of material and content to cover, let's go ahead and move through and get started. There are typically two objectives to consider when studying sport and exercise psychology. Number one, how psychological factors affect physical performance for the individual, and two, how participation in physical activity affects one's psychological development, as well as their health and well-being. With that in mind, it's also important to remind you that at various points along the way we will be referring to groups, clients, athletes, individuals, and regardless of how we label this scenario, the outcome and the execution of your skills is the same. We say sport and exercise psychology, as your author indicates on page 4, to reflect the broader field involving psychology and physical activity among those who participate. One of the main roles of exercise and sports psychologists is to conduct research and to share their findings with others in the field and have it subject to peer review. By definition, sports psychology is the study of psychological and mental factors that influence and are influenced by participation and performance in sport, exercise, and physical activity, and also the application of the knowledge gained through the study to everyday settings. The knowledge that comes from professional practice, in addition to scientific knowledge, is needed to be a successful sport and exercise psychologist. This is in addition to the coaching skills that you will need to be successful to understand participants or those who are trying to become physically active and the effects on activity on their psyche. Professional practice and the practical knowledge in sport and exercise psychology is what one learns from working as a professional in sport and exercise science. This involves teaching, coaching, fitness leadership, or even sports medicine. Therefore, we have to have an expanded section dedicated to coaching as is indicated, and this is one of the main fields for application of this discipline because you'll be able to learn some of the psychological core work, but being able to apply this information, it's altogether different and relative to what you're trying to accomplish, whether you are an athlete, a coach, or someone working in an individual or group setting. It then follows that the scientific study of people and their behaviors in sport and the practical application of that knowledge will mean that some coaching skills will definitely be used. Not all sport and exercise psychology specialists are trained in the same way. Clinical sport and exercise psychologists are trained to treat athletes and exercisers with severe emotional disorders. Educational sports psychology specialists serve as mental coaches, educating athletes and exercisers about psychological skills and their development. As it has been indicated before, there are three main fields of specialty within the sports psychology discipline: research, training, and consulting. Now, the primary function of any scientific field is to advance the knowledge within that field by conducting research for peer review. And this could include a broad range of topics, including trying to understand motivation within youth sport, or achievement and personality traits that contribute to team activities such as football or baseball. Additionally, we do need to be able to tell the difference between the two specialties. The first one, clinical sports psychology, is different than that of educational sports psychology in that a clinical sports psychologist can both assess and treat individuals with emotional disorders, and they are licensed by state boards for the states that they work within. Some athletes or exercisers, or even anyone taking part in physical activity, can develop severe emotional disorders and can require special treatment from time to time. Eating disorders and substance abuse are two main areas in which a clinical sports psychologist can often help a sport or exercise participant. On the other side of this, we have the educational sports psychologist. These specialists have extensive training in the exercise and sports science field, or physical education, and even some coming from kinesiology, and they understand the psychology of human movement as it relates to sport and exercise context. These specialists also have taken advanced degrees to the graduate level and have training in psychology and counseling. However, they are not trained to treat individuals or athletes with emotional disorders like their clinical sports psychology counterpart, nor are they licensed psychologists. Both particular psychology fields must have a thorough knowledge of both psychology and exercise and sports science. To qualify for certification as a consultant, someone going through the discipline must have advanced training in both psychology and sports sciences. This requirement is designed to protect the public from unqualified individuals who might try to practice outside of their scope. The field of sports psychology has grown a lot in the past 20 years. This is due to it becoming a more valid science and more popular among psychologists because of the increase in sports and physical activity in our culture. But it would be a mistake to assume that this is a new field because the roots for sports psychology actually are traced back to just before the turn of the century. In the first period, known as the early years, work was done by Norman Triplett, who became interested in the observations that he noted when he saw different behaviors displayed between individuals cycling for pleasure compared to the performance of those engaged in group activity. Triplett wanted to understand why cyclists sometimes rode faster when they raced in groups or pairs than when they were riding alone. Like any science, Triplett began with using the scientific method and formulating a hypothesis. Triplett started by observing cyclist behavior and tried to verify observations through study. To test his hunches further, he began to research and do experiments with cyclists. This experimentation allowed him to make more reliable predictions about behavior and performance. During this time, Triplett studied reaction times and also studied how people learn sports skills and discussed the role of sport and personality within the frame or context of character development. And even though a lot of work was done in this particular time, it was very rarely applied. This may have been due to the fact that there was no one at that time specializing in the field. Period 2 was known as the Griffith era, and this was roughly from 1921 till 1938. And Griffith was the first North American to spend a significant amount of his career and dedicated it to sports psychology. For his contribution and work within the field, Griffith has been referred to as the father of American sports psychology, and Griffith developed the first laboratory for sports psychology. He also authored 2 books and was a contributor to a series of studies done with the Chicago Cubs baseball team. Later, he worked with football coach Newt Rockne. Griffith was considered ahead of his time and also is known for his high-quality research. And his methods and techniques still serve as the model for research that is conducted currently. Period 3 would set the groundwork for the future. Franklin Henry was key to this particular movement. Henry was largely responsible for the scientific aspect of development within the discipline. Most of his time was dedicated to the scholarly study of psychological aspects in sport and motor skill acquisition. Even more importantly was Henry's work in teaching others to understand physical education and sports psychology. This particular collaboration led to systemic research approaches that are still used today. Some of the studies that were done have reshaped curriculums and developed sport and exercise science programs within the fields of kinesiology or other exercise science disciplines as we know them today. In this way, this is what we mean by Henry laying the groundwork for future study of sports psychology, as he helped create the academic discipline that was required within the discipline and into the future. However, the application was still limited in the field. The fourth period in sports psychology history is known as the establishment of academic sports psychology and roughly spans the time frame from 1966 to 1977. By the mid-60s, physical education had become an academic discipline, which was now usually being called kinesiology or exercise and sports science. Sports psychology had been typically put aside or developed separately as a separate component within the discipline, distinct from the motor learning aspect of exercise science. And in this separate division, sports psychologists would tend to study psychological factors such as anxiety or self-esteem, and even the characteristics or personality traits that are seen among participants in sport or physical activity. And the goal during this time was to better understand the influence of sport and motor skill performance and how participating in these activities in sport and physical education influenced psychological development for the exerciser or the participant. Period 5 was known as the multidisciplinary science and practice approach in sport and exercise psychology. And this spans from the time frame from 1970 roughly until around the turn of the century in the year 2000. During this time, there was tremendous growth seen within the discipline, not only in North America, but internationally as well. In general, the field of sport and exercise psychology became more accepted and respected by the public, as well as within academia. During this time, which was characterized by components of application of sports psychology concepts, growth and development of exercise psychology and sport as a specialty area for research and practitioners began to take hold. Sport and exercise psychology also became further separated from other psychological-related exercise and sport science components, such as motor learning, control, and even motor development. Also during this time, the level and quality of research increased. This helped to broaden the appeal of this discipline in different fields and began to branch into psychology. Students and professionals with backgrounds in general psychology began to enter the field in bigger numbers, while training within this particular discipline, either academically or by any means of education, began to become what we call multidisciplinary as a perspective. This evolved into the need for students within the curriculum to take courses that were more based on psychological components, instead of just relying on the exercise science physical components of sport, or establishing licensure and developing full-time positions for the increasing number of people involved or interested in sports psychology. Sport and exercise psychology as a field or discipline continues to thrive worldwide. It is now believed that there are over 2,700 sport and exercise psychologists now working within approximately 60-plus nations or countries. In 1965, the International Society of Sport Psychology was established. To be able to work with exercisers or participants in a sport or exercise setting is different than to sit and read a book about sports psychology. In order to be successful or to apply it, you must have some integration of scientific textbook knowledge along with practical knowledge or experience. Throughout this particular course, our goal is to help you develop the skills so that you can be able to better use sport and exercise psychology and the knowledge gained from it, and to apply it within whatever field you are working. Let's remember that, first off, sport and exercise psychology is a science. And like any science, it would make use of the scientific method to evaluate a hypothesis. Science is a process or a method of trying to understand the world through systemic and controlled and empirical, critical filtering of knowledge acquired through the experience of research and application. One of the goals to applying the science that is learned from studying sports psychology is to be able to describe and explain, predict, and allow control of behavior within sport and exercise environments among participants or players. The scientific method dictates that there's a systemic approach to trying to understand a particular observation or hypothesis that's being studied. It also follows that there is control of the conditions within the study. This is what we would refer to as the variables, or key elements within the research. So they do not influence the primary relationship within the study. The variables must be identified and sometimes isolated. Making use of the scientific method means that we must express it empirically. In other words, it's based on observation. We have to seek to find objective evidence to support our beliefs or hypothesis that we're testing, and the evidence has to be open to outside evaluation by peers for validity. This analysis of work completed in the field will help ensure that conclusions drawn from research or experiments is not only replicatable and valid, but reliable. The ultimate goal of the scientific method is to devise and prove a theory. This could also be viewed as a set of interrelated facts that present a systemic view of some sort of phenomenon or something that you are seeking to describe or explain, and then predict in the future. When we discuss and consider theory, we can say that it would allow a scientist to be able to organize and explain vast numbers of facts in a pattern that helps us understand them better. Once this understanding is reached, it is ideal when that theory that has been hypothesized and proved can be then turned into practice. An example of this is the social facilitation theory, and this is related to psychologists studying how the presence of an audience affects performance. In some studies, we can see a pattern in the seemingly random results of a formulated theory, but in the social facilitation theory, research contended that an audience creates what we call arousal in the performer or the participant. In the social facilitation theory, it's contended that an audience can create arousal in the participant, which can hurt performance on difficult tasks when they have not been learned properly, and helps performance on those tasks that have been mastered. So the influence of social elements that are present and evaluative to the exerciser or participant are an example of having tested a scientific method through observation after formulating a hypothesis or a theory, and then being able to prove and present that theory to others for review.